Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm your host, Ryan Coonerty. The New Deal and An Honorable Profession just celebrated our second podcast anniversary. We've had so much fun bringing you the best of American leadership. If you haven't already, please check out some of our previous episodes with leading mayors, attorney generals, state legislators, and the thinkers shaping the future of the Democratic Party. Even in these difficult times, these folks keep me inspired about American politics, and I hope they do the same for you. Find out more at newdealleaders.org. Today, I'm talking to the guy running the most consequential campaign of our lifetime. Greg Schultz served as Vice President Biden's campaign manager and is now his senior advisor to the campaign, coordinating efforts with the Democratic National Committee. Previously, he managed President Obama's campaign in Ohio, served as a special assistant to the president, and a senior advisor to Vice President Biden. We talk about how things looked for the campaign, as best we can tell, only weeks out from Election Day, what it's been like to be with Biden from the beginning, and what we need to know about his home state of Ohio. Greg Schultz, welcome to An Honorable Profession. It's really fun to be talking to you right now.
Well, thanks for taking some time out to have me. Looking forward to it.
We're talking on Monday, October 12th. The way the world works these days, it's good to put a timestamp on these things. We're less than a month from Election Day. How are things looking?
Tomorrow we're 3 weeks out. So I would say I would much rather be in our position than Donald Trump's position. I think, the reality is we still have every path open to us to 270 electoral votes, and Trump's got a pretty narrow path. However, as we all know, Trump will do whatever it takes to stay in power. So we have to be vigilant. We have to push through. A lot of the first-time voters are going to come out this year. A lot of people who maybe don't vote regularly, and so we have to make sure we communicate with them on how to vote given COVID. But things are positive. I think we've all been through enough elections that I don't want to use the word things look good, but they look good. but I think we just have to take nothing for granted. And again, the good thing is there are a number of states that we are in the lead or tied or within the margin, and added together, they're all well over 270 electoral votes that are in play.
That's what I like to hear. What's something that you're monitoring that you don't think enough of us are talking about or the media is covering right now as we head into the final weeks of the election?
There's a lot of noise out there, and there's a lot of things that I would say Twitter and the political elite reporter class covers, and it doesn't necessarily trickle down to the voters that are truly undecided or are still trying to figure out whether or not they're going to bother to cast a ballot. I think people are going to cover this confirmation hearing and just broad Supreme Court and a bunch of these kind of story of the day, or that's obviously not the story of the day, that's a big story. But in terms of its impact on the election and the voters we are still going after that are still up for grabs, we just kind of operate now as this political thinking engaged class, and then a bunch of Americans who are taking care of parents, taking care of kids, working multiple jobs, and we receive different information from different places, and therefore our priorities become different. So I do think you're going to see 3 weeks of a lot of Twitter and social media and reporters focus on all these topics. This isn't encouraging, but if you look at how many Americans can tell you there are 9 members of the Supreme Court or they have a lifetime appointment, it's a minority of American citizens. And so the way we take this in, there's just going to be a lot of political noise that doesn't actually boil down to will someone vote at all or will they choose Biden or Trump. And so, that's one area. Noise has gotten harder and harder to decipher, just with our no longer 24-hour news cycle, but multiple climate. I also think that there's always a lack of appreciation about losing better for Democrats. And I mean that, regionally, townships, rural areas, exurbs. I think we always look at where Democrats do well and not enough time on where Democrats need to do marginally better. And that's something that Biden is so good at. And it's going to be, I think, another underreported aspect of the cycle, because it almost always is.
So those are two really great insights, and I want to dive in a little bit. You've been, if I listened to recordings for more than a year ago with you, and the Biden campaign and you and specifically have been really clear that you weren't going to let social media drive your efforts. Can you talk about how, when you're managing a campaign, how do you manage away from that noise and towards the voters that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I always say, strategy comes from two places: assumptions and data. And throughout the primary and in the general, we've made some assumptions about the American electorate. Now, some of those are based on that Joe Biden's our candidate, and Joe Biden decided to run for president because he thinks that we are in a battle for the soul of the country. That is not some poll-tested quote or statement. That is truly why Joe Biden is running. And if that's why your candidate is in a race, then you don't move away from that. We also had data, and this is going back to the primary a little bit, but there were some assumptions that, the party as a whole was ideologically at one part of the spectrum or another. We felt the vast majority of Americans actually don't want to think about their president. And most Democrats don't want to think about the president. They want to live their lives. They want to trust that the government is in capable hands. And they just want to live their life. And so when you have these assumptions and you have some data, you stick with that strategy until you have some data that forces those assumptions to change. And I'll be honest, in the primary, despite the political noise on social media, it was never our path to, take policy positions that weren't true to what Biden believes and how he views for us to build this country back. And we just we think so often social media is dominated by the loudest voices that are often in the corners of very different, whether it's parties or efforts, and that there's a broad middle that isn't making a bunch of noise, but is probably more in line, at least where Biden is, than everybody else. And so it takes discipline. I will tell you, again, I know we're 3 weeks out from the general, so there's no reason to look at the primary too much, but there was a lot of pressure day in and day out for Biden to be who he wasn't. And that was never going to be our path. And we felt that once we got to states that reflected a broad diversity of the country and the party, we were going to be more than fine. And fortunately, we ended up being right. But that's also the same for the general. Like, you'll look and there's been some notes, like this primary campaign really looks a lot like, or the general campaign really looks a lot about the primary campaign, how we present Biden, what the choice is, characters on the ballot. The COVID has shifted, obviously, some of that. And competency is always important, but even more important with Trump lying and hundreds of thousands of Americans dying. But it takes discipline. But again, until you have data or some other input that tells you your assumptions are wrong, you stay on your path.
I'm glad you went back to the primary, because I was thinking about a year ago, the campaigns. It seemed very unclear who the nominee was going to be. And whether Joe Biden was going to, he had a majority or plurality lead in the polls, but it was still very uncertain. And you all kept very focused. I'm wondering, as people, how do you keep your candidate, in this case, the Vice President of the United States, focused and not getting caught up in the whirlwind of the day? And then you have thousands of staffers and volunteers on the ground who can get easily panicked or overreact to these messages. How do you sort of manage up and manage down in the world we're in today?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say one of the benefits, I've now been with Joe Biden for going on 7 years right now. So I was on the 2008 campaign and then ran the re-elect in Ohio in 2012. And so I interacted with Biden, from 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, but then had a chance to serve in the administration with him and then obviously afterwards. And I tell you, Joe Biden knows where he comes from. He knows who he is. And I think he understands his priorities and his values because he's been doing this. He's been doing this a long time. In a good way. And I tell you, honestly, keeping the candidate focused, I think Biden also it's amazing. And I don't know if it's from just riding the train or really never living in DC despite working here for, commuting basically for 3.5 decades in the Senate. But I'll be honest, I've had a chance to interact with a lot of Democrats, elected officials, operatives for almost 2 decades now. And I think Joe Biden has closer to the pulse of the average American, if there is such a thing, out of anybody in Democratic politics. And I don't know if it's the Scranton. I don't know if it's being used to bullies. I don't know if it's the train. I don't know if it's part of it's just who he is. And I think part of it is Delaware. It's such a it's a small state population and geography. So Biden knew his constituents, and as importantly, they knew him. And so I think he probably has heard from I hate using these words, like normal people for a long time. And he honestly, his political gut is so much closer to the average voter, an average American, than almost anybody else's. So that part wasn't that hard, honestly. Now I did a call a couple hours ago before recording this, and I was talking with some longtime supporters, and they were also asking about some Trump issue of the day. And I reminded them, here is the voters we're going after. 4% of the country's undecided. Let's say, 4-6% is undecided. And then we've got a bunch of voters that would vote for Biden and Harris, but they may not vote. What do they care about? I think so often those that study politics or follow politics look through, and it makes sense, but they look through all of this through the lens of their own eyes, which, again, total human nature. I think it's a campaign manager and the role I have in the general election. It is keeping people focused, being truthful and honest and transparent. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't. And I think when you do that, even with volunteers and supporters and donors and endorsers, I do think, it takes some trust, but you can earn it, and you just be truthful.
And what do you think those voters, those few undecided, or the ones who are maybe just too busy managing life to be able to figure out a time to vote, what do you think they care about?
Yeah, I tell you the percentage that are undecided, truly undecided, it's such a historically small sample size. I think a lot of them are somewhat disconnected to the political process in a normal way. I think these are people that they have busy lives. Maybe they've been screwed in some ways by various economic situations not within their control, and they want to just they don't watch the news. Maybe they read their local paper, so they're not high information voters like I'm sure everybody that's going to listen to this podcast is. But I think they are saying, I want someone who will fight and stand up but get things done. And Trump sure says he gets things done, and he sounds like he's fighting, but they don't necessarily follow enough media or have enough data to back up, did he actually get something done or not? But then they see Biden, that we're like, well, Biden seems like a nice guy, and it seems like somebody you can trust, and it seems like he's got some good ideas. So I think there's a couple percent. I generally think just they don't, stay current with political news. I do think it goes back to economic messages. I honestly think it's the same for those voters who are soft Biden supporters, who, if they vote for us. I think some of them come from communities, whether it's rural or Appalachia or inner city, that have just been disconnected from the political process, and they don't think anybody hears them or sees them. And so part of our job as a campaign, and as Biden and Harris, is to make sure those voters feel heard and seen. And I think it's a little bit different. I think not everybody wants to be seen and heard, but I do think it's an economic message for all of them. For the truly undecided, it's probably more of an economic, here's what you were promised, here's what wasn't delivered by Trump, here's what we're going to do. Whereas the possible Biden supporter that may not vote is, we see you, we hear you, your frustrations are legitimate, now here's what we're going to do about it. So a little bit similar, but some variance is also an approach.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, it really does come down to that personal connection on some level, even when you're talking at the scale of a presidential campaign. Can I ask briefly? I mean, I've read reports, when the President Obama or Vice President Biden or Senator Harris are coming through the campaign, and they're hitting, especially in the Midwest, they're calling you and they're asking for advice. How do you prepare, and what's your advice for briefing the President of the United States or the Vice President of the United States when they're asking you for a few minutes of your insights into an area of the country?
Yeah, so I think, I had a chance, having spent 44 months running the re-election in Ohio. President Obama and Vice President Biden were there all the time. Then obviously 7 years now with Biden. I think, Obama and Biden, it will take those two in particular. It was such a good partnership because in many ways, I'm not, telling anybody something they don't know, but they were very different in terms of, President Obama was much more analytical. As we talk about, some of where the numbers were in Ohio and some of the issues that, people care about, and some of the, successes maybe Obama and Biden had in the first term and things to highlight and during the re-elect. So one is kind of a more analytical, where Biden really, and he kind of uses this term, he's a tactile politician. And he is very much, I don't want to say an Obama is like a fact-based and Biden's like a not fact-based or vice versa, but Biden is a very relational type candidate. It's all about, Biden in particular wants to make sure that when he's in a room, the people in that room understand that Biden understands their problems. And I think that is so when you're going to a state, and, my specialty, I guess, is being born and raised outside of Cleveland and went to Ohio State, Big Ten country, making sure that the candidates have a chance to hear real perspectives from on the ground. In particular, when you get to an Obama or a Biden or a Harris, they are such gifted, public servants and politicians. They do a good job of connecting people's personal experiences to policy or to just emotive ways to connect. And I think Biden in particular, he always appreciated when there'd be some anecdotes about, sir, we had this program you worked in 2009 and 10, whether it's Recovery Act, and here's how it actually impacted this community. Like Biden in particular loves to drill down, okay, well, how did this policy impact them? How does this policy impact the single mother with 2 kids outside of Youngstown? He gets very in the weeds. And so you have to be prepared in particular with Biden. And I've just spent, multiple times more with Vice President Biden than Obama and certainly Harris at this point. So I know him, much better. But it's really, I don't want to say in the weeds, but he really wants to be able to walk in the room and say, I understand the challenges you face, and I have some ideas on how to help.
Having spent that much time with Vice President Biden, what do you think the media caricature of him gets right, and what do they get wrong?
Yeah, so ice cream, he loves ice cream as much as you think he loves ice cream. I personally have been to, 7 or 8 Dairy Queens with him, whether it's Salt and Straw or Jenny's ice cream. I personally have been to dozens of ice cream since I stopped with him across the country. So that is real. I don't think he gets the credit for having the policy chops that he does. And certainly, going back to the primary, to all these candidates who had all these policy proposals, and which are all great. But Biden, if you talk to people who worked with Biden during the Violence Against Women Act, which he wrote and pushed through, and you talk with people who worked with him on administering the Recovery Act, Biden is, I don't want to say policy wonk, but he has an appreciation for policy and the impacts it can have in real people's lives more than people realize. I think he is such a retail politician. I think people see him as whether it's that moniker, the Uncle Joe, which is real, which is fair. He loves people. I think he feels people's pain and can relate, unfortunately, because of some of his own life. So that part is all there. But it is and again, our policy people, we've got people like Steph Feldman who've been on the policy team with Biden for a long time. They will tell you Biden with policy folks, he wants nuts and bolts. And You can't get away with Biden with just giving him some 100,000-foot view on some policy. I would also say Biden is great about wanting to know what he doesn't know. And so, which is why people should feel, I think, assured if he's forced to be president, he's going to surround himself with people that are super smart and that are going to challenge some of his assumptions. And I think he wants that. I mean, he wants smart people around him, and he's going to maximize their talents and brain better than I think anybody fully appreciates.
I like that. That's good to hear, and it gives us confidence that if we can get a good result in a couple of weeks, we can be headed for a good future for this country and the world. I want to talk about those Midwestern roots you mentioned. You were born and raised in Ohio, went to Ohio State. Ohio's in play. Can you tell us how it looks specifically in the Midwest and talk about the issues animating that part of the race?
Yeah, so you have seen, and we've got our analytics director, Becca Siegel, who's been with Biden now since, we're on day 536, I believe, of since officially launching. She would tell you that a lot of the Midwestern states kind of move together. So I'm going to include Pennsylvania, although I realize it's mid-Atlantic, at least for most of the state. But, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania in particular, Minnesota, it seems like there, when one goes up, they all kind of go up a little bit. When one goes down, they all kind of go down a little bit. So they kind of move, Ohio's slightly older, slightly more blue collar than some of the other states. So it has a little bit, it doesn't quite follow the exact full movement of some of the other Midwestern battlegrounds, but it does close. I think these are economically populous states. And this is why I've been super encouraged that, I kind of call it our North Star policy, but the whole Build Back Better economic plan is something that you can talk about in the Upper Peninsula of Pennsylvania or the Dells of Wisconsin or Appalachia, Ohio or Pennsylvania, and people will listen. And whether it's, building in America, buying American, insourcing jobs, those are things that I think are relatable. And it is something that Biden has, I think, credibility in, just given his years. And I think it is, and I think Biden is seen as kind of a fighter, that scrapper from Scranton, as I think President Obama had said. So I think getting to Ohio is winnable. It's going to be close, and I'm not surprising anyone here. It's been interesting. We are now up in most of the major media markets, in particular the big three, Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati media markets. You've seen President Trump actually go off air. I think you have seen now when he goes on air some places, he goes off air other places. Maybe they're getting more cash. I don't know, but it's been interesting to watch. So we are up with even more points than we had the last couple of months, and Trump is at a lower number. I think Ohio, like much of the country, is seeing a gender gap where women's support of Donald Trump has been shrinking for years. 2018 midterms were a clear sign. The other things about a state like Ohio, where Biden's going to do better in Appalachia or Warren, Ohio, or Youngstown, Ohio, the blue-collar industrial base, even those parts of the state Biden won't win, he will lose them better. And the rural areas, he will lose better than a traditional Democrat. And so we're bullish on certainly Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, but states like Ohio, I think this is one where you've seen a lot of attention. In fact, as we're recording this right now, I think he had just left Toledo. He's like literally on his way to Cincinnati right now. So that's a sign of how serious we take it, that Joe Biden is physically there, as we speak.
Can I ask, as a coastal Democrat, that Democrats have really made a focus over the time when we were in power to assist those Midwestern states, the auto bailout being the most prominent example. How come that didn't pay more dividends politically in 2016 and going forward than I thought it would?
Yeah. So, the auto rescue is a great example. It saved the industry. It saved the economy of this country from going into a Great Depression. One thing that I don't think Democrats are always as good about, I think we can sometimes be too policy, that may come across wrong. I don't mean that we should care about policy because it's how we impact people's lives, but I think we don't take time doing some victory laps. And I think, we need to say, like, we didn't take credit for some of the things we did. Now, I think everybody will argue we were trying to get more things done. But I do think when we have successes, we need to let people know, like, people voted, we made this policy fight, here was the impact, your vote matters. And I think sometimes we don't always connect the progress as Democrats that we're able to make with the engagement of voters and the successes we can have when we're actually able to govern. And so, I think also sometimes Democrats, we forget, as I'm generalizing, of course, as a whole, but we sometimes don't acknowledge people's legitimate, concerns and scares and frustrations. This is something Trump did very well in 2016. I mean, there's a lot of Americans who have gotten screwed, and people will say it's globalization, it's the rise of technology and automation. It's the answer is all of the above, but a lot of people are working harder, making less, and I think Trump took advantage of that, where I think Democrats didn't always acknowledge that, like, hey, you got screwed, but here's what I'm going to do about it. And I think that when Democrats, and that's why Joe Biden I think is going to be successful, because he will acknowledge people got screwed, but then he'll have a plan for it. And then when we actually help them, we help them, I say unscrewed, but when we help them get back on their feet or actually make a wage worthy of the work that they are doing, I think we then need to take credit for it. So there's a couple pieces on why I think the Democratic Party struggles in, middle America.
And so, again, knocking on wood that things turn out as they're trending now, what do you think the Biden administration should focus on in order to resonate and improve lives in those Midwestern states?
Yeah, well, first, I mean, the very first thing is COVID and the economy, and that they are completely linked. And we have got to get COVID under control. We have to have a plan for testing and contact tracing, and we have to plan for a vaccine. And until we get that under control, we are never going to fully be able to build back our economy. And so COVID and the economy are linked. I think one of the pieces that you would see in a Biden administration is infrastructure, an infrastructure plan, an infrastructure bill, efforts, not like I'm not talking about the Trump-Pence infrastructure week, which they have, once a month, but I'm talking about a real infrastructure bill and real infrastructure investments. And, the way Biden looks at it, infrastructure also means addressing climate, and addressing climate means jobs. And so I do think infrastructure, first of all, getting COVID under control, and then infrastructure are huge jump starts to the economy, and something that you can expect in a hopefully and potential Biden administration. And that's when you look at where the crumbling infrastructure, where it's the bridge, the railways, the grid, the ports, certainly across the country, but so much of what this country produces in the industrial Midwest and the industrial and the heartland, that we have trillions of dollars of infrastructure investments we can make. And the thing about infrastructure is you invest in it and it pays dividends back, not to mention the jobs go into place. And so I think, COVID and infrastructure and, rewriting the ship, restoring the basic bargain with American workers and the work they do is some of the things you will see out of a Biden-Harris administration.
I like it. Can you talk about your life and your path into politics? How'd you end up in this, as you said, for the last couple decades, running presidential campaigns?
Yeah, so I grew up outside of Cleveland. My parents are now retired, but they were both special education public school teachers. And my mom taught in a larger school system outside of Cleveland that always, in Ohio, we disproportionately fund schools through local property taxes. It's been ruled unconstitutional at the Ohio level and still operates that way despite being ruled unconstitutional at the state level. So citizens have to vote themselves property tax increases, and so those communities that are not as affluent have harder time passing levies. And what I would do, I would go with my mom door to door as an 8-year-old and a 9-year-old and encourage people to vote for the school levy of the school system my mom taught at, which is not the school system we went to. And so I would also stand outside my mom's school, which is a polling site. on election day. Now I remind people it snows in Cleveland sometimes on election day. So, I was 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old, standing outside of a polling site, encouraging people to vote for the school levy. And so I think that's kind of, I guess if there was a seed planted, that had to be it. And then I actually wanted to be a high school social studies teacher. I worked on campaigns, paid and volunteer through time at the Ohio State University, went to grad school, student taught in Columbus Public in Ohio, loved the energy in the urban school, but they weren't hiring social studies teachers in either urban or Columbus or Cleveland. And it was 2004, and I had worked on campaigns. So I ended up being a field director on a congressional race in 04, and it was Ohio, and everybody lost. And then I was going to substitute teach, but that's a very tough job as I looked for a full-time teaching gig, and ended up running a race and then another race. So I guess public education has been my indirect route to campaigns. And here I am, I graduated Ohio State undergrad in 03. And, I had my first campaign job was freshman year at Ohio State, working for the Ohio House Democratic Caucus on state house races. It's an amazing place to learn. I think people always, it's super sexy, I guess, for politics to work on a governor's or a Senate or a presidential. But people that are in particular, just starting out, a state house race, a township trustee, a city council, a supervisor race, that's where you learn. And so I was fortunate that I got some really good local campaign experience, which I think has just been a great foundation for now national campaigns.
Did you win that school bond race?
Oh, no, they lost them all. No, they lost all the time. No, and it was, we did not.
They looked at your 9-year-old face and then went in and voted no? Come on.
Yeah. There was some older gentleman that would always argue with me. I would remember him every year. He just kept coming. It's like, I'm 9 years old. Why are you arguing with me? So no, there was always a challenge. And I remember sometimes when my mom, who was involved with the teachers union, and there were some times where they almost went on strike. And so no, but it's also part of, my brother is now a high school math teacher. My cousins are teachers. And so for me, public education is an area of focus and kind of a cause for why, I do, I guess, politics and government. And
education is, as you mentioned, is, really driven at the state and local level. And I appreciate your advocacy for all those of us who are down ballot, all the New Deal leaders out there. Can you talk a little bit about how the Biden campaign thinks about down ballot races? The Republicans traditionally have been very good at supporting their down ballot races. What's the party doing to help all those races?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I tell you, the presidency obviously is beyond important, but in normal times when you don't have someone like President Trump driving us kind of off a cliff in some ways, whether it's policy or foreign affairs, local government matters so much. And the day-to-day person interacts with government at the local and state level much more often than they do at the federal level. And so certainly we have to get Biden and Harris elected, but we have so many opportunities, in particular in this year at the state legislative level. In fact, there are, I believe, 8 state legislative chambers that are 30 seats away combined from going from Republican control to Democratic control. And, the local level, it's where not only you get your future congressional members and senators and governors, but it's also where so much policy that impacts people's life in a real sense. Look at, if we're going to address climate change, look at the action or inaction at various state levels. When you talk about economic development, look at the action or inaction at various states that are controlled either by Republicans or Democrats in the state legislators. So we want to make sure that our campaign lifts all boats. And I think there's a lot of local races in districts that are currently held by Republicans that Democrats have a fighting chance. And it's honestly because Biden is going to have real coattails. I think Biden is a candidate that if you're a moderate Republican or an independent or a conservative Democrat, you can be comfortable with. voting for. And when we highlight a economic and jobs proposal like Build Back Better, it is something that everybody can run under. I think sometimes there are some Democrats at the local level that have to distance themselves from national Democrats. That doesn't have to happen this year. And so at the local level in our battleground states, we're working on the ground, in particular with the state house and state senate pickup. So it is crucial, not just for politically, but also just for good government, that we elect Democrats. Like literally, we say it all the time, but up and down the ballot. And I would like to say down the ballot is as important in many ways as the top of the ticket.
Thank you. I obviously couldn't agree more, and especially in a year of census and redistricting in many of those states, the Republicans have held a seat lead even without a majority of the popular vote for a decade now. So hopefully that can get remedied to make it just basically fair and representative of where our country is. I want to wrap up by I don't think people appreciate the organizational challenge of running for president. I mean, you go from a year ago of very relatively small organizations with tens of millions of dollars to an enormous organization in less than a year with billions of dollars. I want to get a sense from you as to how you think about how do you scale that quickly in order to and maintain a focus on goals and quality, and especially in an era where one bad decision by a staffer can become an international story.
Yeah. So I tell you, I'm going to give some shout outs to some groups that don't always get shouted out, but the Democratic National Committee and a number of state parties with Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida, and others. So I don't want to discount any others, but after 2016 made some very conscious decisions that they were going to spend the next several years building up at the local level and the regional level and the statewide level to prepare for 2020. And Biden and then Harris, but Biden and the Biden campaign inherited probably the strongest DNC in terms of data and resources and technology. Their CTO, Nell, who's tremendous, has been on for multiple years, and she and her team have been building. So there's all of these things that aren't built overnight, and they take years to build. And so Biden has been the beneficiary of so much investment at the state and national and local level. So I'll start there. I will also say we benefited because the party as a whole coalesced quickly. And think about all of the great campaign staff for all these other candidates that we have now been able to absorb. And there's all these trained staffers that had been having 6 months, 8 months, a year of experience. And then their candidates, ended their campaigns, and we were able to bring on. And so we weren't building from scratch. We obviously had an amazing team that got Biden through the primary, and then they're now the leadership anchors of this general election. I do think in some ways, we have been able to be more inclusive because of the reliance on Google Chats and Zoom. So COVID has actually forced us to be probably more inclusive with volunteers and other staff than you traditionally are when things are so much in-person based. So that has been helpful as well. And then, it all goes back to knowing who your candidate is and why your candidate is running. And we remained consistent despite being in Democratic primary for a year of of the primary and into the general. We just kind of continued. We had said during the primary, we were running both a general and a primary at the same time. And the only thing that's changed is now we've stopped running the primary. So in some ways, we have had this infrastructure. You add on top of that the party apparatus that had been built up. And then you add on top of that all of the great staff from other campaigns. And we've now got this, I don't use like using military terms, but we have this army of support and the volunteers and the amount of call capacity we are doing and texting capacity is off the charts. So I tell you, nothing focuses one's attention like Donald Trump. I tell you, I think in maybe other years, things may have taken a little bit longer to come together, but Donald Trump I think people realize what's at stake and what 4 more years of Trump would do to this country. And so honestly, that had been a helpful rallying effort to coalesce and build up this apparatus. So here we are with, at this point of recording, 22 days to go. And, we are almost there. We've got work to do, but we are almost there.
Can I just ask that this campaign is so different than any other campaign in history for 2 reasons. One is the existence of Donald Trump, and the second one is COVID. How do you think either one of those plagues will change how campaigns are run, or is this really just a singular moment in history, and after this, things will go back to normal?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's a few colleagues of mine who I've worked with now for well over a year, and all of us are 100% focused on the next 22 days because we have to. That being said, I've had a couple conversations more about some of the, and I mentioned inclusion in one of the previous answers, but there are groups that historically just wouldn't get the attention of a presidential campaign as early as one did, because it was there was the expectation that things were in person. And if you can't get someone to speak to a group in person, then it was taken as a sign of maybe disrespect or not prioritization. But with COVID, the digital virtual world has allowed, I think, that this level playing field. And, just like whether you're a community that is 13% of the country's population or you're a community that's 0.5% of the country's population, you now can participate and have interaction with leaders and surrogates in a way that just when there was a physical expectation, you couldn't do. And I do think that people are going to appreciate, hopefully in future races, that the Zoom events shouldn't go away. Now, I do think there is a hunger and I miss rallies, and trust me, nobody misses rallies more than Joe Biden, who kind of feeds off that energy. But I do think there are ways to include people that are not possible by doing things in person. And I hope that continues because it will just be good for the party. And hopefully it continues in 21 and 22, because we're going to have super important township trustee races in 21, and the midterms are going to be super tough. Now, of course, we've got to focus for the next couple of weeks first. So I do think that there are some silver linings, and we've just been able to, the amount of conversations and dialogues that you've been able to do in this virtual world, whether it was, some of these former all-star casts of popular TV shows coming together, or these different salon kind of series on very interesting and timely conversations around criminal justice or race in America that the campaign has been able to do because we can now operate virtually. So I am hopeful that we do rallies in the future once we get COVID under control, but we still have the virtual interactions as well.
All right. Well, maybe we can come back and we can talk again in December and January after you've been successful and had a little bit of sleep, and then we can talk. I was going to say sleep. Yes. Yeah, we can revisit all these questions. But I want to.
That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, exactly. It's just that where you're daydreaming of sleep. I want to thank you for the service you're providing our country. This is obviously the most critical election of our lifetimes, and you played a major role in getting us a candidate that not only can win in November, but also, again, help all those other races and offices, and then make policy that improves people's lives. So Greg Schultz, thank you for joining us today, and good luck over the next 22 days.
Thank you for the opportunity, and good luck to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you, Greg.
That was great. I really appreciate you. Those are great questions. Hopefully that was helpful.
Very helpful, and good luck, and I hope to see you when we get the new deal back together. It'll be great to see you and congratulate you in person.
Would love that. Thank you for everything you do.
Thank you. All right, bye-bye. Thanks for listening to An Honorable Profession. Please subscribe to hear more amazing leaders, and keep asking your elected officials to be honorable. Boots Road Group produces this podcast. I'm Ryan Coonerty, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars were used in the making of this podcast.